So let's take a look at Jonas's The Burden and Blessing of Mortality. Hans Jonas is the author. And I think that after reading Epicurus and Nagel, reading Jonas it widens the field quite a bit in terms of death. You know, Nagel was focused on a very specific question, and that's good. It's a particular way of thinking. Doing philosophy is being very narrow in your focus and trying to be very rigorous about particular questions. Jonas's essay is not like that. It's much more wide-ranging and tries, in a way, to answer the biggest questions about death, the meaning of death, and the human meaning of death. So there's quite a bit to cover in this essay. It's a very short essay, but he has a lot to say, not only about death, but what it means to be alive. And I think that's really the key to at least the first half, the so-called burden of mortality, is to see that his philosophy of death is really part and parcel of this philosophy of life, and what it means to be alive, and specifically what it means to be an organism. Now, we'll talk about that, but, well, maybe that point comes up right away in what he says in the very beginning of the essay. Men alone of all creatures know that they must die. Men alone mourn their dead, bury their dead, remember their dead. So much is mortality taken to mark the human condition that the attribute mortal has tended to be monopolized from man. So, you know, that is that we have a special relationship as human beings with mortality because we are aware, in one would imagine, a way that no other animal is aware of our mortality, of the fact that we're going to die. But right away he tells you that he has a larger focus, or not a larger focus, a larger perspective in mind when he says in the next paragraph that we share the lot of mortality with our fellow creatures, that all life is mortal, indeed that death is coextensive with life. So that the first part of this essay about the burden of mortality really doesn't specifically apply to human beings. It applies to human beings, of course, but only insofar as they are organisms, only insofar as they are biologically alive. And everything that he says about the burden really could apply to anything that's alive, at least any animal, one would imagine, well, any plant too, actually. And I think that the key here, of course, in understanding the basics of the essay is to understand the distinctions that set up the contrast between the burden, so-called, and the blessing, so-called, of mortality, and that can be found in the third paragraph. He says, two meanings merge in the term mortal, that the creature so-called can die, is exposed to the constant possibility of death, and that eventually it must die, is destined for the ultimate necessity of death. So on the one hand, mortality means that we organisms, we things that are alive, can die at any time. That is, death is a continual possibility. Every moment brings with it the possibility of ceasing to be alive. On the other hand, mortality means the ultimate necessity of death. That is, that no matter how many moments we may live and therefore escape death, that eventually we will die. He says that in the continual possibility, that is, the notion that at any time we can die, I place the burden. In the ultimate necessity, that is, that I will die someday, I place the blessing of mortality. So that's important to get that right away. That is, the burden of mortality, in the way that Jonas sees it, is in the fact that at any moment we can die. There's the continual possibility of death. The blessing, somehow, he's going to argue, is the very fact of us being mortal, in the sense that we do not live forever, that any life will end in some finite way. So those distinctions, that distinction, is the most important thing to keep in mind in terms of getting your thoughts straight about what he's saying. Now let's do one video where we talk about the burden of mortality, and that's much more the complex point that he's making, and another video in which we talk about what he means and how he argues for the so-called blessing of mortality.